The night they forced me out of the car, the temperature was 34 degrees and falling. I know that because I remember staring at the dashboard display right before the door swung open. 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 11:47 p.m., and the GPS showing we were on Route 9, somewhere between Millbrook and the county line, where there are no streetlights, no gas stations, no houses. Just trees on both sides, and the sound of semis hauling freight at 70 miles an hour, 50 yards away. My son Caleb was 8 months old. He had a fever of 103.1. I was still in the clothes I'd worn to the pediatrician's office that afternoon. Yoga pants, a hoodie with a spit-up stain on the left sleeve, sneakers with no socks because I'd grabbed them in a hurry. And my husband Brandon shoved open the rear passenger door from the outside, reached in, and said the words I will never unhear for the rest of my life. "Get out. You gave birth to a sick child. You deal with it yourself." His mother Karen was in the front passenger seat. She didn't turn around. She just stared straight ahead through the windshield into the dark and said very quietly, very precisely, like she was reading from a grocery list, "You won't get a single cent from us for his medicine. Not one." And then Brandon slammed the door. The taillights of his Chevy Tahoe, the one I helped pay off, the one I put $8,400 of my own savings toward, disappeared around the curve. I stood there on the shoulder of Route 9 with my baby burning up in my arms, and I thought, how did I get here? How did I not see this coming? Because here's the thing about being abandoned in the dark on a highway with a sick child. It doesn't happen out of nowhere. You think it does. You want to believe it does. Because believing that makes you a victim of lightning, a victim of the universe, just spectacularly unlucky. But when you finally stop shaking long enough to look back honestly, you see all the signs you explained away. Every single one. I need to tell you about the before, because the before matters. It always does. I met Brandon Holloway the summer I turned 26 at a 4th of July cookout at my college friend Stephanie's house in Westfield, New Jersey. He was 29, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that reads as security when you're 26 and exhausted from 2 years of dating emotionally unavailable men. He grilled burgers. He remembered that I'd said I didn't like mustard and went back to make me a new one without being asked. He laughed with his whole chest. I was done for by the end of the night. I know that sounds embarrassing to say out loud, but it's the truth. My name is Ashley Mercer. Or it was Ashley Mercer, before I became Ashley Holloway, and now I'm working on becoming Ashley Mercer again, which feels more right every single day. I grew up in Edison, middle class, nothing dramatic. My dad, Dennis, worked for PSE&G for 30 years. My mom, Linda, taught second grade and made the best chicken cutlets in the tri-state area, and believed firmly that you showed people who you were by whether you sent thank you notes within 48 hours of receiving a gift. I was the kind of kid who followed the rules, got decent grades, not spectacular, got a degree in communications from Rutgers. Not exactly a golden ticket, but I worked my way into a marketing coordinator job at a mid-sized pharmaceutical company in Parsippany, and by the time I met Brandon, I was making $58,000 a year, had $22,000 in savings, and was 6 months away from paying off my student loans completely. I was proud of that. Nobody handed me anything. Brandon was a project manager at a construction company his uncle owned, Holloway & Sons, which sounds impressive until you realize it was 4 guys and 2 trucks and a lot of weekend jobs redoing people's driveways and kitchen floors. But he made decent money, around $72,000, and he talked about expanding it, hiring real crews, taking on commercial contracts. He had plans. I loved that about him. I loved that he was going somewhere. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. He did it on a Sunday morning in our pajamas in the kitchen of my apartment in Metuchen, with a ring he'd clearly thought carefully about. A simple solitaire, not flashy, exactly what I would have chosen. He said, "I don't want to wait anymore. You're my person." and I said yes before he finished the sentence. We got married the following October. Small wedding, 68 people, at a venue in Cranford with Edison bulb lights and a live acoustic duo and a catering spread that included my mom's chicken cutlets because I insisted, and the venue coordinator almost had a breakdown about outside food, but ultimately caved. It was the best day of my life. I genuinely believed that. I have the pictures to prove I was glowing. We bought a house 8 months later, a 3-bedroom colonial in Scotch Plains, $387,000, which meant a mortgage payment of $2,140 a month and an HOA fee of $175. And we both agreed it was a stretch, but a smart stretch. The neighborhood was good. The school district was excellent. We were thinking ahead. Brandon's mother, Karen, lived 20 minutes away in Plainfield, and at the time, that felt like a reasonable distance. Close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough for privacy. I liked Karen, at first. I want to be honest about that. She was organized, sharp, always impeccably dressed, even when she was just running errands. She brought food when she visited, always something homemade, usually a pot of her beef stew or a lasagna wrapped in foil with little sticky notes about heating instructions. She asked questions about my job and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. She told me once, early on, that Brandon had finally done something right. I took that as a compliment. That was my first mistake. The first year of marriage was genuinely good. We fell into rhythms that felt easy. I handled the bills and the budget. I was better with numbers. And Brandon handled the house maintenance and the yard. We cooked together on Wednesdays, always something new from a recipe app he'd downloaded. We went to Home Depot on Saturday mornings, like every other couple in our zip code, and argued companionably about paint colors for the guest room. We had movie nights and fought about whose turn it was to pick. We were boring and content, and I was so deeply, genuinely happy that I sometimes caught myself just sitting in our kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking at the morning light on the countertops thinking, I built this. We built this. This is real. I got pregnant in the spring of our second year of marriage. It wasn't planned exactly, but it wasn't a surprise either. We'd talked about kids, agreed we wanted them, agreed we weren't going to be rigid about timing. When I saw the 2 lines on the test, I sat on the edge of the bathtub for a full 10 minutes before I called Brandon in from the living room. He cried, happy tears. He hugged me so hard my feet came off the floor. Karen cried too when we told her 2 weeks later over dinner at her house. She immediately started talking about the guest room at her place, how she'd been thinking it could be a nursery for when she babysat, how she already had a name in mind. She mentioned Caden twice, which I filed away as a minor flag, but let go because she was excited and it was a lot to ask of a grandmother to not have opinions. The pregnancy was normal, uneventful. I worked until 38 weeks, finished a big campaign launch 2 days before I went on maternity leave, and felt good about that. We took a birthing class. We assembled the crib together on a rainy Sunday in February, Brandon cursing softly at the instructions while I read them out loud with a flashlight because the overhead light in the nursery had burned out and we hadn't replaced it yet. Caleb was born on March 14th at 6:22 in the morning after 17 hours of labor, and when they put him on my chest, I understood for the first time what people meant when they said, "Your heart lives outside your body." He was perfect. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, dark hair, dark eyes, Brandon's chin and my nose. Perfect. Except not quite. The pediatrician at the hospital, Dr. Okonkwo, came in on the second day with a look on her face that I had learned, in my 31 years on this earth, to dread. The look that means someone is about to carefully arrange words into a sentence that will change your life. She sat down. She said Caleb's newborn screening had flagged something. She said the word spina bifida, and then several other words I didn't fully absorb because my brain had locked onto those two and wouldn't let go. Brandon was there. He held my hand. He asked good questions. He seemed steady. That was March. By November, 8 months later, he would be shoving me out of a moving car on Route 9 in the dark. But I didn't know that yet. Sitting in that hospital room, holding my son, I thought the hardest part was just beginning. The medical stuff, the adjustments, the learning curve of loving a child who would need more from the world than most. I had no idea the hardest part had nothing to do with Caleb's spine. It had to do with the man sitting next to me, squeezing my hand, looking at our son with an expression I was already starting, just the faintest edge of it, to misread. The first sign came 6 weeks later, and like all first signs, it was small enough that I almost missed it entirely. The first sign came 6 weeks after Caleb was born, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. I was home on maternity leave, still learning the brutal math of caring for a newborn, the every 2-hour feedings, the endless cycle of wash, dry, fold for tiny onesies, the way time stops meaning anything when you haven't slept more than 90 minutes in a row. Caleb had a follow-up appointment that morning with Dr. Okonkwo and a pediatric neurosurgeon at Overlook Medical Center named Dr. Patel, who was monitoring the spina bifida diagnosis and talking through what the next year might look like in terms of interventions. It was a lot of information. I'd brought a notebook. I'd written things down in handwriting that got progressively shakier as the appointment went on. Brandon hadn't come. He had a job in Westfield, he said. Couldn't move it. I said, okay. I meant it. I really did. One appointment wasn't a pattern. I drove myself. I took my notes. I called him from the parking garage afterward and walked him through everything Dr. Patel had said. And he listened and said the right things. Okay. What do we do next? Whatever Caleb needs. But that evening, when I asked if he wanted to look at the pamphlets Dr. Patel had given me, information about the Spina Bifida Association, about what physical therapy might look like, about what questions to ask at our next appointment, he set his fork down and said, "Ash, I just need one night where I don't have to think about it. Can we just have dinner?" I said yes. I stacked the pamphlets neatly on the corner of the kitchen counter. They sat there for 11 days before I finally moved them to a drawer. I told myself it was stress. I told myself he was processing it in his own way, on his own timeline. I told myself that grief, and it was grief in a way, the recalibration of the future you'd imagined, didn't look the same on everyone. I had read enough parenting forums and enough Reddit threads about special needs families to know that fathers often took longer to come around, that it wasn't abandonment, that it was fear wearing a different mask. I believed that. For a while, I really believed that. The confrontation I should have seen coming happened on a Friday night in late July, when Caleb was 4 months old. Karen had come for dinner. She came most Friday evenings now, which had gone from pleasant to something I had to consciously manage my energy around, because she had opinions about everything and had recently started having opinions specifically about Caleb's medical care. I had made pasta. Simple. Penne with a red sauce, garlic bread, a salad. Nothing elaborate, because I was exhausted, and I was always exhausted. Karen sat at our kitchen table while I finished at the stove, and she watched me with that particular expression of hers that she probably thought looked neutral, but actually looked like someone quietly grading a performance. "I was reading," she said, in the careful tone she used when she was about to say something she'd rehearsed, "that a lot of these diagnoses, the spina bifida ones especially, a lot of times they're overstated. The doctors want to run tests, do procedures. It's how they bill." I turned from the stove. Dr. Patel is one of the top pediatric neurosurgeons in the state, Karen. I'm just saying what I read. Where did you read it? She waved her hand. Online, a forum. There are mothers there who've been through similar things, and they say the same thing. The medical establishment has a financial incentive to... Karen. I kept my voice level. I was proud of that later. Caleb has a confirmed diagnosis. It was identified through a standard newborn screening and then confirmed by imaging. There's nothing overstated about it. Dr. Patel is trying to help us understand what Caleb's development is going to look like and what we can do to support him. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Brandon, who was sitting at the table pretending to be absorbed in his phone. "Brandon," she said, "don't you think Ashley should get a second opinion before they start all this intervention business?" And Brandon put his phone down and said, "I mean, it doesn't hurt to get another opinion, Ash." The room went very quiet. I served the pasta. I sat down. I ate. I said nothing else about it that night, because I had learned by that point that some arguments were better won by not having them at the table. But I lay awake for 2 hours after Karen left and Brandon fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, replaying the way he'd said it. It doesn't hurt to get another opinion. Not a disagreement with me, not a statement of his own position, just a gentle alignment with his mother, just enough agreement to not be on my side. That was the night I first used the word, even just in my own head, in the dark, the word pattern. By the time Caleb was 6 months old, in September, the pattern had a shape I could almost trace with my finger. Brandon didn't miss every appointment. He came to maybe half of them, enough that I couldn't accuse him of total absence, not enough that I felt supported. When he did come, he sat in the chair next to me and held Caleb and asked questions, and I would feel this flood of relief so intense it almost made me dizzy. Because here was the man I married, being the father I knew he could be, and maybe I'd been catastrophizing, maybe everything was fine. And then we'd get home, and Karen would call. She always called on the evenings after appointments, and the conversation would shift. I'd hear him in the bedroom, door most of the way closed, his voice low. "I know, Mom, I know. It's a lot." And then, quieter, I don't know how bad it's going to get." I stood in the hallway outside that door once, on a Thursday in September, with Caleb asleep against my shoulder, and I listened to my husband talk to his mother about my son's future, like it was a problem he was trying to figure out how to exit. I knocked and pushed the door open. Brandon looked up. He said, "Mom, I'll call you back," and hung up. "What are you telling her?" I asked. "Nothing, just updating her." "I heard you say you don't know how bad it's going to get." "Ashley, he's 6 months old, Brandon. He's not dying. Dr. Patel said his prognosis for mobility is actually good, given the level of the lesion. We've talked about this." Brandon rubbed his face with both hands. He had the look of someone who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, tired of something he hadn't yet said out loud. "I know what Dr. Patel said." "Then why are you talking to your mother like we're in crisis?" He looked at me, and for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, just long enough that I caught it and then watched him pull it back, he looked at Caleb in my arms with an expression that wasn't love. It wasn't hate either. It was something worse. It was the look of a man looking at a problem he hadn't signed up for. "I'm tired," he said. "Can we just not do this tonight?" I left the room. I fed Caleb, I gave him his bath, the little blue baby tub on the kitchen counter, and I watched his face while the warm water ran over his belly and he made the surprised, pleased face he always made, the one that crinkled his nose exactly like mine. And I told myself, it's going to be okay. He's adjusting. This is hard for everyone. But I started keeping notes. Nothing dramatic, just a small notebook in my nightstand, the kind you get in a 3-pack from Target. I started writing down dates and things, appointments Brandon missed, things Karen said, the small moments that felt individually like nothing, but that I was beginning to understand were not nothing at all. September 14th. B didn't come to PT eval, said work. Karen called after, talked to him for 40 minutes. September 22nd. Karen suggested we look into a different diagnosis, said her friend's grandson was misdiagnosed. October 3rd. B said he needed space to process. Asked if I could handle the Caleb stuff for a while. Handle the Caleb stuff. His son. 8 words that told me everything. The rug pull moment, the one that collapsed whatever remained of the false floor I'd been standing on, came on a Saturday in October, 3 weeks before the night on Route 9. We were supposed to go to Karen's for lunch. I'd dressed Caleb in a little fleece outfit, navy blue with small white stars, and packed the diaper bag and was loading everything into the Tahoe when Brandon came out of the house and stood at the end of the driveway with his arms crossed and said, "My mom wants to talk to us about something." "Okay," I said. "We're going there now, so—" "About the house." I stopped. "What about the house?" "She thinks, and I've been thinking about it too, that maybe this house isn't the right setup anymore, with Caleb's needs, the stairs, the layout. She has a ranch house, more accessible. She thinks it might make sense for us to move in with her for a while." I stared at him. "Move in with your mother?" "Just temporarily, until we figure things out." "Until we figure what things out, Brandon? We have a mortgage. We have a house. We have—" "The house is a financial strain, and you know it." His voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. Not quite anger, more like something that had been decided already and was being presented as a discussion. "The mortgage, the HOA, Caleb's medical bills are going to stack up. My mom has space. It makes practical sense." "Your mother doesn't want to help us," I said, very carefully. "Your mother wants access. There's a difference." He looked away toward the neighbor's yard and said nothing. "Brandon," I waited until he looked at me. "Have you already talked to her about this, before talking to me?" The pause before he answered was 3 seconds long. I counted. "We've discussed it, yeah." 3 seconds. And I knew, with the cold clarity of someone who has finally let themselves see what they've been refusing to look at. This wasn't a conversation. This was a notification. And whatever was happening in my marriage had been happening for longer than I'd understood, in conversations I hadn't been part of, between my husband and his mother, about my life and my son and my home. And I had been the last to know. I buckled Caleb into his car seat without another word. I stared out the passenger window the entire drive to Plainfield, 14 miles of suburban New Jersey landscape going orange and red with October. And I thought about my notebook in the nightstand and wondered if I had enough pages left. I didn't say anything at Karen's lunch table. I watched Brandon and Karen exchange small looks over the pot roast, the kind of looks that have a shared language behind them, a private shorthand built over weeks or months of conversations I wasn't in. Karen refilled my water glass with the particular graciousness of someone who knows they hold the better hand. She asked about Caleb's next appointment. She used the word "our" when she talked about his care plan. Our next steps, our concerns about the therapy schedule. Our. That night, after we got home and Caleb was down and Brandon was in the shower, I sat on the edge of our bed and opened the notebook and wrote the date and one sentence. "I think I need to call a lawyer." I didn't call one that week. I should have. But I was still trying, still holding on to the version of my life that I'd built and loved and wasn't ready to admit was already gone. That was a mistake. But it was the last naive mistake I made. Because 9 days later, Caleb spiked a fever of 103.1, and Brandon put us in the car and drove us toward the pediatric urgent care in Millbrook, and somewhere on Route 9 in the dark, he stopped the car instead. So there I was, Route 9, shoulder of the road, 34 degrees and dropping. The taillights of Brandon's Tahoe gone around the curve like they'd never existed. My son, burning up in my arms. No coat. I'd grabbed Caleb's blanket from the diaper bag before Brandon yanked it out of my hands and threw it back in the car. But I had nothing on myself except the hoodie with the spit-up stain, and the cold was the kind that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in, starts at your fingers and your ears, and works inward with quiet, methodical efficiency. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, but was probably 15 seconds, just processing, the way your brain does when something happens that it has no template for, no file labeled "abandoned on highway with sick infant by husband," no protocol, just the hiss of wind through the tree line and the distant roar of an 18-wheeler somewhere ahead in the dark. Then Caleb made a sound, not a cry, more like a small, confused whimper, the kind he made when something changed around him too fast. And that sound cut through the shock like a key in a lock. Okay, I thought, phone. I had my phone in the front pocket of my hoodie. I'd grabbed it reflexively when Brandon told me to get out. Muscle memory, the modern survival instinct. My hands were already shaking when I pulled it out. The screen lit up, 11:49 p.m., battery at 38%. I opened my contacts and scrolled, and for a moment, a genuinely terrible moment, I couldn't think of a single person to call who could reach me in the next 20 minutes on a dark stretch of Route 9 in Millbrook at midnight. My parents were in Edison, 45 minutes away, minimum, if my dad got dressed and got in the car right now. My friend Stephanie was in Westfield, same distance, different direction. I hadn't told either of them how bad things had gotten. I'd been protecting the image, protecting the marriage, protecting Brandon's reputation from the people who loved me and would have seen through him faster than I had. I called 911. The dispatcher, a woman with a calm, practiced voice that I have never forgotten, her name was Denise, according to the call log I later pulled, stayed on the line with me for 11 minutes. She confirmed my location from the cell tower ping, told me a Union County Sheriff's unit was 6 minutes out, told me to stay on the shoulder and face traffic so I'd be visible, told me to keep Caleb warm and as still as possible. She asked his age, his fever, his symptoms. She was efficient and steady, and I think she is one of the reasons I didn't fall apart completely in those minutes, because she gave me something to do. Answer questions, stay on the line, keep talking. The cruiser came with its lights on but no siren, which I was grateful for because the lights were already making Caleb fuss. The deputy's name was Officer Marcus Webb, a big guy, maybe 35, black, with a kind face under the official expression. He got out of the car and walked toward me with a flashlight angled low to the ground, not in my eyes. And the first thing he said was, "You, Ashley? Dispatch said you've got a sick baby." "Yes," I said, and my voice came out in a way I wasn't expecting. Not steady, not crying, just completely flat, like I'd used everything I had just to stay upright. He had a Mylar emergency blanket in the cruiser. He wrapped it around both of us, me and Caleb together, and he got us in the back seat with the heat running, and he asked me what happened. And I told him. All of it, in about 4 minutes flat. The fever, the car, Brandon, the words he'd said, the door swinging open, the taillights disappearing. Officer Webb listened with his notepad out, and he didn't make a face, he didn't look skeptical, he didn't say, "Are you sure that's what happened?" the way I'd half expected him to. He just wrote it down. "Do you want to press charges tonight?" he asked. I looked at Caleb. His eyes were closed, his little face flushed with fever, his breath coming in the slightly too fast rhythm that Dr. Okonkwo had told me to watch for. "I need to get him to urgent care first," I said. "Millbrook Pediatric is on Route 28. "I'll drive you," Officer Webb said. No hesitation. He radioed ahead. By the time we pulled up to Millbrook Pediatric Urgent Care at 12:23 a.m., a nurse named Donna was already at the door with a wheelchair. Not for me, but habit, because they expected a parent to be carrying a child. And she took one look at Caleb and waved us straight back without checking us in. I sat in the plastic chair next to the exam table and watched a doctor named Dr. Reyes check my son's temperature, his reflexes, the fontanelle at the top of his head, the tone of his limbs. She asked about his diagnosis, and I pulled up my notes app because I had learned to keep everything there, every medication, every diagnosis code, every doctor's name and phone number, and I read it all off while my hands shook against the phone screen. "He's going to be okay," Dr. Reyes said after about 20 minutes. "Fever this high in an infant with his history warrants monitoring, but his vitals are stable. We're going to bring the fever down, run a couple of checks, and then I want to talk about keeping him here for observation until morning. Is that all right?" "Yes," I said, "absolutely yes." She left the room, and I sat there in the hard plastic chair under the fluorescent light with Caleb finally, blessedly asleep on the table with a hospital blanket tucked around him, and I put my face in my hands and I let myself fall apart for exactly 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I watched the clock on the wall. I gave myself 4 minutes to shake and cry and feel every single thing I had been holding back since the door of the Tahoe swung open. The terror, the humiliation, the cold, the specific, shattering grief of realizing that the man I had married, the man who had cried happy tears when I showed him the pregnancy test, had looked at our sick child and chosen to treat him like a problem he could dump on the side of the road. 4 minutes. Then I wiped my face on the sleeve of my hoodie, the one with the spit-up stain, and I picked up my phone. I called my mom. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant either she couldn't sleep or, more likely, my mother had some antenna about her children that no amount of geographic distance could fully suppress. "Ashley?" Her voice was already alert. "What's wrong?" "Mom," I said, "I need you and Dad to come to Millbrook Pediatric. Caleb's okay. He's being treated. He's stable. But I need you to come." A pause of about half a second. "We're getting dressed right now," she said. "We'll be there in 45 minutes. Don't you move." She didn't ask where Brandon was. Maybe she already knew, on some level, the way mothers know things. Or maybe she understood that if Brandon were there, I wouldn't be calling her at midnight from a pediatric urgent care, alone. They arrived at 1:18 a.m., my dad Dennis in a PS-E&G sweatshirt he'd clearly grabbed off the floor, my mom Linda in her good coat over her pajamas, both of them moving through the door of that waiting room with the specific energy of parents who have received a middle-of-the-night call and are operating purely on adrenaline and love. My mom went straight to Caleb. My dad came straight to me. He sat down next to me and put his arm around my shoulders and didn't say anything. He just held on. And that, his arm around me, the familiar smell of his flannel shirt, the simple, wordless weight of my father being there, that was when I really cried. The kind of crying that isn't about being weak. The kind that's about finally being safe enough to feel what you've been carrying. When I could talk, I told them everything. Not just tonight, everything. The notebook, the pamphlets in the drawer, Karen's dinner table commentary, the look on Brandon's face in the bedroom doorway when he'd looked at Caleb like he was a problem, the conversation about moving into Karen's house, the way Brandon had said whatever Caleb needs in March, and then spent 6 months methodically walking those words back. My dad listened with his jaw set in a way I recognized, the expression he got when something made him angry enough that he was making an active decision not to speak yet. My mom sat on the other side of me at some point, holding my hand, and twice she said, "Oh, baby," very quietly, and that was all, because my mom is a woman who knows when words help and when they don't. When I finished, my dad said, "Where is he now?" "Home, I assume, or Karen's." "And the house, it's in both your names?" "Yes, joint mortgage, both names on the deed." My dad nodded slowly. He looked at my mom. She looked back at him with that 40-year married communication that doesn't need words. Then he looked at me. "Ashley," he said, "first thing tomorrow morning, I want you to call a family law attorney. Not to decide anything, just to understand what your rights are. Can you do that?" I thought about the notebook in my nightstand. I thought about October 3rd, handle the Caleb stuff. I thought about standing on Route 9 in 34-degree air with my feverish baby and watching taillights disappear around a curve. "Yeah, Dad," I said. "I can do that." Caleb was discharged at 6:45 a.m. with a reduced fever, 99.8, almost normal, and a course of antibiotics and instructions to follow up with Dr. Okonkwo within 48 hours. My parents drove us back to Scotch Plains in their car. I sat in the back with Caleb in his car seat, watching the early morning light come up gray and pale over the New Jersey suburbs, the trees stripped down to their bare November bones. My dad parked in our driveway. Brandon's Tahoe was there. The lights in the house were on. The kitchen light, the living room. Someone was awake. My mom turned around from the front seat. Do you want us to come in with you? I looked at the house, at the lights, at the life I had built inside those walls, the Edison bulb kitchen and the HOA-regulated lawn, and the nursery where Caleb's mobile still turned slowly in the heating vents draft. I thought about walking through that door. I thought about what Brandon would say. I thought about whether he would apologize, and whether I would believe it, and whether any apology in the world had the weight to balance what he had done. No, I said, I need to do this part myself. I unbuckled Caleb, lifted him against my shoulder. He was warm and sleepy and smelled like hospital soap and himself, that specific sweet smell of him that I would recognize anywhere on earth. I kissed the top of his head. I walked up the front path. I pushed open the door. Brandon was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He looked up when I came in, and for one brief second, his face did something complicated. Relief, maybe, or guilt, or the specific expression of a man who has spent several hours sitting alone with what he did. Karen was not there. It was just him. He opened his mouth. "Don't," I said. Just that one word. I carried Caleb upstairs. I laid him in his crib. I stood there for a moment watching him breathe, that steady, small rise and fall, and then I went to the nightstand and I picked up the notebook. I took it downstairs. I sat across the table from Brandon. I set the notebook between us. "I need you to understand something," I said. My voice was very steady, steadier than it had been in months maybe. "I have documentation going back to September. Dates, conversations, incidents. I have a police report from last night. Officer Marcus Webb, Union County Sheriff. I have medical records. I have everything." Brandon stared at the notebook. He didn't touch it. "Tomorrow morning," I said, "I'm calling a family law attorney. Not to decide anything yet, but I want you to know that the conversation we're about to have, the one where you explained last night, is not the only conversation that matters anymore. There are going to be other conversations with people who have law degrees, and I am going to be ready for every single one of them." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car drove past on our street, ordinary and oblivious, someone going to work at 7 in the morning like it was just another Wednesday in suburban New Jersey. Brandon looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time since March, since the hospital room, since before Caleb was born and the man I married started becoming someone I didn't recognize, he looked genuinely, completely afraid. Good, I thought. Now we're starting to understand each other. The attorney my dad had in mind was a woman named Patricia Osei. He'd gotten her name from a guy at work whose daughter had gone through a divorce 2 years earlier, and he'd written the number on a Post-it note and handed it to me before he and my mom pulled out of the driveway that Wednesday morning. I called her office at 8:02 a.m., 2 minutes after they opened. Her assistant told me she had a cancellation at 11 a.m. I took it. I left Caleb with my mom, who had not gone home. She'd announced, without any particular drama, that she was staying and had settled herself into our guest room with the quiet authority of a woman who has made a decision and will not be argued with. I drove myself to Patricia's office in Westfield, parked in the lot, and sat in the car for 3 minutes looking at my notebook. 47 entries, September 14th through November 8th. Dates, quotes, incidents. A record of a marriage dismantling itself in plain sight while I kept finding reasons not to look directly at it. Patricia Osei was 52, sharp-featured, with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead, and a desk that was organized in a way that made me feel, immediately, that she had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. She listened to me for 25 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the notebook I'd placed on her desk. I hadn't opened it yet, just set it there like an exhibit, and said, "Walk me through the property situation." I did. Joint mortgage, both names on the deed, $387,000 purchase price in Scotch Plains. Current market value, based on what similar colonials in our neighborhood had sold for in the past 6 months, was probably around $415,000. We owed $341,000. That was roughly $74,000 in equity, split 2 ways. And your income situation, she asked. I'm on maternity leave. My position at the pharmaceutical company in Parsippany is protected. I confirmed that with HR last week. I paused. I think I already knew somewhere that I was going to need to know that. Patricia looked at me over her glasses. And his income? Project manager at Holloway & Sons, his uncle's company. $72,000 a year, roughly. Any joint accounts? Checking and savings. I have full access to both. I've been managing the finances since we moved in. I opened the notebook to the last page and turned it toward her. I wrote down all the account numbers and current balances this morning. For the first time, something that might have been a smile moved across Patricia's face. Not a warm smile, more like the expression of a chess player who has just seen their opponent make a revealing move. You're more prepared than most people who sit in that chair, she said. I had a long night to think, I said. She laid out my options clearly, without sugarcoating. New Jersey is an equitable distribution state. Assets and debts acquired during the marriage are divided fairly, though not necessarily equally. Given Caleb's diagnosis and ongoing medical needs, I had a strong basis for arguing primary physical custody and for seeking child support that accounted for his specific care costs. The incident on Route 9, the abandonment, the police report, Officer Webb's documentation, was significant. That report, she said, is not nothing. That is, in fact, something. What about the house, I asked. You have options. You can sell and split equity. You can buy him out. Or, given that you have a child with medical needs and an established residence, you can argue that maintaining the marital home for continuity of care is in the child's best interest. She paused. Do you want to stay in the house? I thought about it. The nursery with the mobile, the kitchen with the morning light, the HOA lawn I'd watched Brandon mow every other Saturday, the guest room where my mother was sleeping right now. Yes, I said. I want to stay. Then we have a strategy, Patricia said. I got home at 1 p.m. Brandon's Tahoe was gone. My mom said he'd left around 10, hadn't said where he was going, hadn't asked about Caleb. She said it with the particular flatness of a woman who was keeping her actual opinion contained for my sake. He came back at 4:30. Karen was with him. I was in the kitchen feeding Caleb when I heard the front door. My mom was in the living room. I heard the sound of 2 sets of footsteps, Brandon's heavier tread and Karen's lighter, quicker one, and then Karen's voice carrying down the hallway. Linda, why are you still here? My mom's voice came back perfectly pleasant. I'm visiting my daughter and my grandson. Would you like some coffee? There was a pause that I would have paid money to see the expression behind. Then footsteps again, and they both appeared in the kitchen doorway. Brandon, with the same look he'd had at 7 that morning, complicated and guilty and not quite sorry enough. And Karen, in her good camel coat, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, her expression arranged into something that was trying to be concern and landing closer to strategy. Ashley, Karen said, we need to talk about last night. Okay, I said. I didn't stop feeding Caleb. I kept my eyes on him. Brandon made a terrible mistake. He knows that. She put a hand on Brandon's arm, the gesture of a lawyer presenting their client. He was overwhelmed. The pressure of everything, the medical bills, the diagnosis, the uncertainty. It became too much, and he reacted badly. He wants to apologize. I looked up at Brandon. Do you? He met my eyes. Yes. Ashley, what I did was, I shouldn't have done it. I'm sorry. The room was quiet for a moment. My mom was in the doorway now, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, watching. Brandon, I said, where did you drive after you left us on the highway? He blinked. Home. Directly home? I stopped at a gas station to get some air. And you didn't call 911 yourself. You didn't turn around. You didn't call me. I kept my voice even. You drove home and you let me stand on the side of Route 9 in 34-degree weather with your feverish 8-month-old son, and you went to sleep. I didn't sleep. The kitchen light and the living room light were both on when my parents brought us back at 7 this morning, I said. So no, you didn't sleep. but you didn't come back either. You sat in the house we bought together, and you let your sick son spend the night in urgent care without his father, and you let me manage that alone. And the reason I was able to manage it at all is because a sheriff's deputy named Officer Webb drove us to Millbrook Pediatric at midnight because my husband had abandoned us on a state highway. Karen opened her mouth. I turned to look at her directly, and something in my expression must have landed differently than she expected, because she closed it again. Karen, I said, you told me I wouldn't get a single cent for his medicine. Those were your exact words. You said them to my back while the car door was still swinging shut. I paused. I want you to know that I wrote that down. I wrote down the date, the time, the location, and your exact words. I've been writing things down since September. I reached behind me to the counter where I'd placed the notebook that morning after coming home from Patricia's office. I set it on the kitchen table between us. Neither of them moved toward it. I met with a family law attorney this morning, I said. Her name is Patricia Osei, and her office is in Westfield. She has a copy of Officer Webb's report, a copy of Caleb's medical records from last night, and a copy of this notebook, which I scanned and emailed to her before I drove to the appointment. I looked at Brandon. I want you to understand that this is not a threat. This is information. I am telling you where things stand so that there are no surprises. Brandon sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. He looked for the first time like a man who understood that the conversation he'd been preparing for, the apology, the reconciliation, the return to a version of normal that let him off the hook, was not the conversation that was actually happening. Karen's voice, when it came, was different. The rehearsed quality was gone. What was left was something smaller and harder. You can't take him to the cleaners over one bad night, Ashley. He said he was sorry. People make mistakes. He left his disabled infant son on a highway in freezing temperatures, my mom said from the doorway. Her voice was very quiet. Linda Mercer, who sent thank you notes within 48 hours and made the best chicken cutlets in the tri-state area, looked at Karen with 40 years of raised children and held together families behind her eyes. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. Karen looked at her. Something moved across her face. Not quite shame, but the thing that lives next door to it. I want you out of this house, I said to Karen. You are not on the deed, you are not on the mortgage, and you are not welcome here right now. Brandon, Karen started. Brandon can make his own decision about where he goes, I said. But you, Karen, I'm asking you to leave. If you don't, I will call Officer Webb's non-emergency line and explain that my mother-in-law is in my home and refusing to leave, and I will let him handle it. She left. She took her camel coat and her chain-hung glasses, and she walked out the front door with the stiffness of a woman who has never, in her entire life, been addressed that way in someone's kitchen. And the door shut behind her with a click that felt, in that moment, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Brandon didn't follow her. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she left, his hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing. My mom quietly took Caleb from me and carried him to the living room. And it was just the two of us in the kitchen, in the house we'd bought together, in the life we'd built and I'd loved and he'd been slowly, quietly walking away from for 8 months. I don't know how I got here, he said finally. I don't know who I became. I know, I said. I watched it happen. He looked up at me. His eyes were red. Is there any way? No, I said. Not cruelly. Just clearly the way you say something you've known for a while and are finally ready to say out loud. There isn't. Not after last night. Not after 8 months of what came before it. He nodded. He looked back down at his hands. I'll talk to Patricia's office about the logistics, I said. I want to keep the house for Caleb's continuity of care. I'll buy out your equity. I want to work this out without a fight, Brandon, because fighting costs money and time, and I need both of those for our son. But I need you to work with me, not with Karen. He was quiet for a moment, then, okay. Just that, okay. And I believed it. not because I trusted him the way I once had, but because I could see in his face the specific exhaustion of a man who has been trying to maintain a version of himself that was never quite true and has finally run out of the energy to keep it up. The divorce was finalized 7 months later, in June. Patricia was everything my dad's colleague had promised: thorough, unflappable, precise. Brandon cooperated, mostly. There were 2 contentious weeks in February when Karen apparently convinced him to push back on the buyout figure, but Patricia sent a 3-paragraph letter that referenced the police report and the documented pattern of behavior and the likely outcome of a custody hearing if it came to that, and the pushback stopped. I bought him out at $37,000, half the equity, clean. I refinanced the mortgage into my name alone. The monthly payment went up by $180, which I managed by picking up one remote freelance client through a contact at my old company. It was tight for a while. Not impossible. I've done tight before. Karen did not come to any of the legal proceedings. She sent Brandon a card after the divorce was final. I know because he told me in one of the civil co-parenting exchanges we'd negotiated our way into. He didn't tell me what it said. I didn't ask. Officer Marcus Webb, I sent him a thank you card. Handwritten, the way my mom raised me. He sent back a short note saying he was glad we were okay. I have that note in the same drawer where I used to keep the pamphlets from Dr. Patel's office. The pamphlets I eventually took out and read, cover to cover, and then joined the Spina Bifida Association's parent network, and then started showing up to their monthly virtual meetups, and then started moderating one of them. Caleb is 16 months old now. He is doing things the doctor said he might not do, or might do later, or might do differently. And he is doing all of them with the specific, stubborn enthusiasm of someone who has never read a single prognosis and has no intention of starting. Dr. Patel used the word remarkable at our last appointment. I wrote it down. Not in the old notebook, that one I put in a file with the police report and the legal documents, sealed in a manila envelope in the filing cabinet in the home office that used to be the guest room. In a new notebook, a better one. My name is Ashley Mercer again, as of June 14th. It felt exactly as right as I thought it would. My dad took me and my mom and Caleb to dinner to celebrate. Not somewhere fancy, just the Italian place in Edison where we used to go on report card nights when I was a kid. And my dad ordered the good wine and gave a toast that was only 6 words long. To Ashley Mercer, she's still standing. I am. That's the whole story. That's everything. I used to think that the worst night of my life was the night on Route 9, the cold, the dark, the taillights disappearing, the weight of my son in my arms, and the understanding that the man who put me there had been making that choice for months before he ever opened the car door. And it was a terrible night. I won't pretend otherwise. But here's what I know now that I didn't know then, standing on the shoulder of that highway at 11:49 p.m. with 38% battery and no socks. Sometimes the worst night is also the last night. The last night you spend being someone's footnote. The last night you explain away the thing you already know. The last night you stand in the dark waiting for taillights that aren't coming back. After that night, every light I walked toward myself.